Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Asad Lalji. Welcome to another session of Avid Online. A warm welcome to those who've joined us for the first time. Please refer to the chat box for more information about Avid Learning and our partners for this evening's discussion. Over the years, or almost 10 years, Avid's curatorial focus has looked at cities and their cosmopolitan histories. Through our coveted series Multipolis Mumbai and more recently the Urban Legacy series, we've examined the journey of how colonial Bombay has become the Amchi Mumbai, or our maximum city of today. In our online avatar, the Cultural Capital series aims to celebrate a wider swath of India's great cities and their legacies and how they continue to be vibrant centers of culture. Today, we look globally at London, Shanghai, Jerusalem as cities that have shared history with Mumbai and Pune and how they were influenced by one remarkable business dynasty, the Sassoons. The Bangalore Literature Festival, Bombaywalla Historical Works, Penguin Random House India, and Avid Learning welcomes you to Sassoons, the Global Merchants, a fascinating lecture demonstration by author and professor of history and politics at Georgetown University, Joseph Sassoon. Drawing from his recent book, The Global Merchants, The Enterprise and Extravagance of the Sassoon Dynasty, Joseph will share insights on how these influential merchants of the 19th and early 20th century shaped the city and discuss their contribution economically, politically, socially, as well as towards the arts, culture, and architecture. Joseph will then be in conversation with historian and founder of Bombaywalla Historical Works, Simin Patel, discussing prominent members of the Sassoon family and their contributions in shaping Bombay into a modern port city. To know more about each of our speakers, please refer to their very impressive bios that have been posted in the chat box. Please note the session will last 45 minutes, followed by a 15-minute Q&A. Simin will be taking questions, so please do keep them submitted in the Q&A box throughout. On that note, thank you once again for tuning in. Over to you, Joseph, for your presentation, and look forward to a fascinating session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The Sassoon, a Baghdadi Jewish family, built a global trading enterprise by taking advantage of major historical developments during the 19th century. Their story is not just one of an Arab family that settled in India, traded in China, and aspired to be British. It also presents an extraordinary vista into the world in which they lived and prospered economically, politically, and socially. Jews had been a continuous presence in Mesopotamia for some 2,500 years since the forced exile in the 6th century BC following the conquest of Judea by the Babylonians. There were thriving Jewish communities in all cities in the province of what is now called Iraq, and there were likely more Jews there than anywhere else in the Arab East. For many years, the father of David Sassoon, the dynasty's founder, Sheikh Saleh bin Sassoon, was appointed by the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire as the chief treasurer of the province of Baghdad. But a corrupt governor in the 1820s poisoned the relationship. The Sheikh and his son David and David's family fled to Bushehr in southern Iran. And there have been a couple of reviews in England and other places that they escaped because of a pogrom. That is really incorrect. They escaped because of this corrupt governor, and in fact, David's siblings all stayed behind in Baghdad. In Bushehr, David learned about India in general and about the city Bombay in particular. The city was the destination of so much of the trade passing through Bushehr. David could have opted for Isfahan, Persia's largest trading center, or followed other Baghdadi Jews to Bahrain and other Gulf countries to take advantage of the burgeoning flow of goods between the Gulf and India. But memories of the family's suffering at the hands of Dawood, this is the corrupt governor, were fresh, and the relative security offered by the British rule accordingly attractive. So the decision was made. The Sassoon would cross the Arabian Sea and begin a new life in India. But then in Bushir, David's father died, and so David took his family and his young family and made the hazardous journey to Bombay. This is the founder of the dynasty, David Sassoon. When David Sassoon arrived in Bombay in the early 1830s, its inhabitants numbered no more than 200,000, but were very diverse: Hindus, Muslims, Parsis, Armenians, Portuguese, and Jews. There was a Jewish connection with the city from the 16th century. By the early 1830s, there were approximately 20 to 30 families out of a Jewish population of about 2,500, and these families called themselves, quote, Jewish merchants of Arabia, inhabitants and residents in Bombay, end of quote. One traveler to the city in 1837 estimated the number of Baghdadis at 350, which of course represented less than 1% of the total population. Later on, Arab Jews were referred to erroneously as Baghdadi Jews, irrelevant of where they came from, as long as they were from Muslim countries. This is, of course, Bombay. David strived to familiarize himself with the merchants and the commodities they traded in Bombay. He began learning Hindustani as soon as he arrived, adding it to his fluency in Arabic, Hebrew, Turkish, and Persian, and spent his days by the cotton exchange, talking to traders and agents, scrutinizing the international news for anything which might send prices up or down, and making contact with his old acquaintances in Baghdad and the Persian Gulf. The community, who came to be known as the Babylonian Jewry, possessed its own language, and that language was called Baghdadi Jewish. It's actually a dialect of Arabic written in Hebrew letters. When the Sassoon began trading and communicating between different places, the Sassoons took advantage of this language and used it in their correspondence, making it almost impossible for outsider to decode. This is a good example of their correspondence. Notice how crowded the page is. There is no paragraph. It jumps from one subject to another. In the beginning, it's always very formal. To my brother, the dear, may God protect him, blah, blah, blah. And then by line 3, criticism began. You know, you didn't sell, you didn't do this, you didn't do that. But one thing was very, very important and keeps coming in these letters: the reputation. David Sassoon instilled in the family that you can lose money and remake it many times, but reputation you can lose only once, and it comes across. Now, in the family archives, which is in the National Library in Jerusalem, there are tens and tens of thousands of these documents, and based on these documents, I put together the history of the family. Not long after his arrival, David started exporting textiles on a small scale to merchants in the Ottoman Empire. After the Opium Wars ended in the 1840s, he began trading opium, but he was then a small player of a different order of magnitude to Jardine Matheson or Jamsete Gigi Boy, and David's name is notable by its absence in the newspaper and archives of the 1840s. He started as a small player, and his elevation into the first rank of businessmen in Bombay was gradual. There was no single event or trade that dramatically changed the state of affairs. He just continued developing his network of traders and exploiting opportunities when they arose. Family was of immense importance to him. His first wife died at a young age in Baghdad after bearing him two sons and two daughters. His second wife, who outlived him, gave birth to six sons and four daughters. And it's really the small army. Gigi Boy actually wrote once that the success of David Sassoon is because he had these 14 children spread around the world. The sons were trained in business from their youth and were later sent to different locations, such as Baghdad and the Gulf ports, to meet other traders, gain experience, and learn the Arabic. Once in Bombay, David realized that the fate and success of the family had to be tied to the British Empire, and the firm of David Sassoon and Sons began a long connection serving British colonial economic and political interests wherever they had branched out. The fact that the governor of Bombay from 1834 to 1838 was Sir Robert Grant, who lobbied in the British Parliament for the repeal of, quote, all civil disabilities affecting British-born subjects, quote, meant that the city was exceptionally welcoming to Jewish traders. Bombay was conducive to the life of minorities like the Jews, but others, and welcomed them in different aspects. This is a tram ticket that I found, which helps religious Jews to take the tram on the weekend, on the Saturday. Although David neither set foot in Britain nor spoke English, he really never learned it. David Sassoon was granted British citizenship in recognition of his services. So 20 years after his arrival in Bombay, he swore the oath of allegiance to the British, and he still has not learned enough English to sign his own name. It was signed in Hebrew. Growing in the Ottoman Empire, he never understood why his oath of allegiance was not only to a sovereign, but also to the East India Company, which controlled India at the time. And this is his oath of allegiance in 1853. The Sassoons felt they were part of Bombay and of India at large, and realized that their new home afforded them safety and security. And one of the wonderful things that come out in the archives is when they went traveling in that language, they always talked about return to the al-balad al-aziz, the dear home. And that's really how they described it time and again until the third and fourth generation, which became very, very anglicized and wanted only to be English and only English. Because of feeling so well in India, they purchased Grand House in Bombay. This is their house, Sanssouci, where a lot of events took place, big celebrations. In the book I describe, the accession of Queen Victoria took place there. This is obviously to all people living in Bombay. It is the Messina Hospital today. By the way, inside the hospital, there are still remnants of the Sassoon. You can find in the second floor the coat of arms. Their offices were in Rampart Row. And again, this is a picture of the decoration of the office. And given the fact they were hobnobbing with the English, of course, they wanted beautiful house. And so they had this beautiful house in Balabashwar, which still exists and still as beautiful as it was, and nothing has changed in more than 150 years. Want to just shift a little bit and talk very briefly about the main characters in the book of Global Merchants. So David Sassoon, we spoke about, he's the founder. Abdullah, that's the oldest son, who in 1872 moved to England and became Sir Albert. By the way, they all anglicized their name. The second son is Elias, who really opened China. The minute the Opium War finished, he was shipped at a very young age to Shanghai, to Hong Kong, to different parts, and started exploring business. And he really coordinated all that. Now, the one thing people forget is that David Sassoon dies in 1864. The two sons go into head-to-head conflict. Elias refuses that Abdullah becomes the new chairman, the new David Sassoon, but that was the will of the father. And he argues that he has made enough contribution that it should be 50-50. The result that the two brothers split, and there is two competing firms of David Sassoon and Co. and E.D. Sassoon and Co. Farham, which is a fascinating personality. There is a whole chapter about her in the book. I argue that she was the first CEO woman, not only in India in 1894-5 until the beginning of the 20th century, but throughout the world. There were a lot of matriarchs, but she definitely was the only one who was a global CEO managing the day-to-day activities. And she was really a phenomenal personality. And last, there is Victor Sassoon, who is a grandson of Elias. And so he's part of the E.D. Sassoon who moves to Shanghai from India in 1926 and shift the business. One of the, of course, I argue in the book, the aspects and the tragedies of the family in the sense of business, that Victor bet on China and lost, of course, his connection to India. And in 1941 and 49, when the communists took over and nationalized all the assets of the Sassoons, he bitterly said, "I gave up India, but China gave me up." There were other personalities, Suleiman, who lived also in Bombay and who was Farha's husband. And when he died, she inherited him. And then for others, in the book, there are other personalities. There is the ones that are very well known, such as the First World War I poet Siegfried Sassoon. There is Sir Philip Sassoon, who was the Under Secretary of Air in the 1920s. But these people have become so English, they really did not want to even admit their association with being a Baghdadi family. They started spreading that they are originally from Spain because, with the racism that existed, Orient did not sound a good thing. So, saying you're coming from Spain sounds much nicer. I think that, and of course, because of their feeling about the country, their philanthropy. Let me just briefly talk about that. The founder and his oldest son, Abdullah, initiated a truly innovative method. They taxed every trade they did, irrelevant of whether the trade was profitable or not, 0.25%. And that 0.25% shows up exactly in the same way as, say, maritime insurance or cost of shipping. And think about it, when they're doing hundreds and hundreds of trades, at the end of the year, a very large amount has accumulated from that 0.25% tax. And they built in the cities that they lived. So this is the David Sassoon Library that all of you knows that still exists. It's a stunning building. And this is the entrance. This is this hospital in Sassoon, Pune, and other places. And I'm sure other people have pictures of other buildings. Just a final word, really, before finishing. I want to talk very briefly about their global reach. One of the most fascinating things is how they spread. When I said in the beginning that the beginning was very modest, there was not a single event, throughout those years, people started spreading around. This is a map that I put together, which really indicates how far. Notice that most of them are port cities because of trading. For example, with China, they sold opium to China, imported silk and tea, but they traded rice, they traded pearls, they traded other commodities. The three reds are the big hubs. The biggest hub was Bombay, then the second biggest was Shanghai, and the third, London. And London doesn't become the main hub until the 1880s. But then when Flora becomes the CEO, Bombay returns to become the main hub. The second part of my book, obviously, is really what happened to this dynasty and how they lost this incredible, almost empire in such a short time, but maybe that's for another talk. Thank you very much, and I really appreciate all of you coming.
Joseph, thank you. Thank you for this journey from Baghdad to Bushaya to Bombay and Pune and Mahabaleshwar. And I was thinking about a similar journey that was made at the time from Iran to India and then from Bombay to Pune by the Aga Khan. And there was a time in Bombay in the 40s, in the 1840s, where you have two prominent exiles living in the city, and they use Bombay's marketplace to basically build a global empire and dynasty. Both these men choose to be buried over here, David in Pune and the Aga Khan in Mazgaon in Bombay, in a beautiful mausoleum. And I appreciated your point about belonging and how the Sassoons always wanted to return to Bombay. Could you tell us a little bit more about that sense of, of exiles and how exiles belong to cities, and what happened in the subsequent generations also?
Thank you very much. I mean, I think you have to put it in the context of a refugee family, an immigrant. Usually classic stories, we talk about rags to riches. Actually, here there are 4 levels. It starts with riches because they were very prominent and well off in Baghdad. Then they fled, and there goes to the rags. Then they go to Bombay and build it slowly and surely. So they go to riches, and then a huge decline in the 20th century. I think it was really his bet that going to India is, and it comes across that what he heard from traders and others, Indians and non-Indians, that in India, people do not care about religion. And they care about you. And if you are a trader, you're going to be successful. And that really appealed to him because he felt that both he and his father, did everything served the Ottoman Empire, but then comes a corrupt governor and huge upheaval in their lives. And it's very interesting because when they arrive, and given the fact that it's a small city, it's much easier. And one of the things that comes across in 120 years of archive, which really, really hit me to the core, not once one member of a family asked, should we trade with A or B because of his religion or ethnicity or sex? Never, never, ever. It was always about one question: can we trust the other trader? And remember, they never met these traders. They never spoke to them on the phone. It's messages that took 3-4 weeks. So repetition, repetition, repetition. And I think that's really why whether the Aga Khan, the Tatas, the Sassoon, all kinds share things. There is in the philanthropy, there is very clear that they talked about issues facing Bombay at the time. For example, suddenly you see two of these families investing in girls' education at the same time.
Right. Okay, that brings us to women and to Flora, who's really my most fascinating character, Farah, who then becomes Flora when she anglicizes her name. And she, for us, is, Bombay's first Setani. She is a woman at the age of 38 who steers a global business from Bombay. And while her great-grandfather David was amongst Bombay's first Sethias, the first generation of merchant princes who were very invested in Bombay's civic life. And along with David Sassoon, you had Jamshedji Jiji Boy, you had Jagannath Shankar Seth, you had Roger Faria, you had Muhammad Ali Rogai. I hope I'm not missing anybody. But David was the Jewish component of that. And it is the Sassoons from these 5 families that produced the first female counterpart to the Sethia a few decades later. So really, what was it about the family, and what was it about Flora? You have some wonderful details about her office life. So tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I wouldn't say that the family wanted. In fact, they really all special. Abdullah kind of accepted. They were all by now in London. She is in Bombay. Her husband died, and she says, I'm ready to run the business. And that's a shock to the family, a shock to the mercantile group in India. There was a letter saying, oh, now we have to shake hands with a woman. I mean, it gets complicated. But they really didn't have any choice. Abdullah knew her very well, the brothers less, and they really, really didn't like it. But none of them was willing to go back to Bombay or Shanghai to run the business. And of course, once she got into it, and the more successful she was, the more they conspired against her. It really bothered them that she is so successful. There is this notion of, a representative from the American Congress is coming to India and to make a study of the cotton and textile. And he sends a note that it's enough just to talk to Farha, because no one else. And of course, this goes out into American newspapers, and which even upset the Sassoons more about it. So there was a lot of that. I wouldn't say that the Sassoons pushed for a woman. I think that the Sassoons did not have any other option.
Okay, not what we want to hear, but I guess that's
but that's the reality.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, you also mentioned that, from the book that Flora seems to be very litigious. I mean, even suing a garage owner over the sale of a car. So could you tell us a little bit about David's generation and the early decades of the Sassoons in Bombay? Did they take to law, recourse in courts, or were they suspicious of law? And when does that time come when they're willingly, going to court to kind of resolve things?
It's interesting. I think in the beginning there was no legal cases until it begins with the business in China. And unlike in India or Burma or other places, they didn't know the language, they didn't know the customs. So they hire these compradors. And these compradors are not working for any family. They are working for themselves as independent agents. And of course, given the distance, given the lack of knowledge of language, of culture, of the rules of China, there is a lot of money disappearing and trades done. So there is a very litigious period, and there are a couple of academics who have written analysis of these court cases that kept going on. Of course, legally, it was not a fair system because as a foreigner, you don't go to a Chinese court, you go to a British court that will deal. So they always got a more sympathetic ruling in these courts. I think it becomes more of a principle, It's not the amount of money, we pay on time, you have to pay on time, you give me your word, I give you my word, I stick by my word, you have to stick by my word. And it becomes a little bit more kind of stubbornness aspect, which I think it's in the genes of the family, rather than, whether it's worth X, amount of money.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, the Aga Khan also takes to the courts very readily. And it's through the courts that he's able to establish his leadership over the community. So very fundamental use of the courts. And it's interesting how the trajectory flows for the Sassoons. With Flora, I thought it was remarkable in terms of what she did in the rift between the two companies, E.D. Sassoon and David Sassoon and company. She kind of restores this and makes peace between these two giant firms.
Yeah, it is really remarkable. She realized the minute Abdullah dies, and Elias has died much earlier, that this is such a stupid thing, that they are having the same problems, facing the same issues relating to cotton and textile, the same issue with regard to the opium, which the business was going down, with a lot of issues arising and a lot of opposition. The whole thing was from the beginning. It's interesting. They sat on the board of the same banks, like HSBC Bank, the banks in India. So there would be a representative. I don't believe that they never chatted to each other. I don't believe. And also Bombay, we're talking about 1870s. It's not today's Bombay. If you live in the same neighborhood and you're going to the same office day in and out, I assume you would run into each other. But the brothers have no correspondence. The two oldest brothers, Abdullah and Elias. And Elias' son dies very young age, a few years after the split. And Abdullah sends a message of condolence, but he really doesn't talk. He talks more about the son. So there is a total separation, one of those stubborn anger. I will never talk to you. You will never talk to me. So when they both died, she, being the wise person, thought, let me put them back together. It's really stupid.
Okay. Also in the book, we get some sense of the differences and the tensions between the Baghdadi Jewish community in Bombay and the local Bene Israeli community. And I was wondering what these dynamics were and where the European Jews fitted into these kind of three groups in the city.
Yeah, it's really interesting. There was racism and discrimination at each one of those levels. I think, when they came here, there was lack of acceptance of the Bnei Israel, both on religious grounds, but also, as I said, on racist grounds, with the color. There is really, truly no, intermarriage or any of them, at least in the first 50 years, working for the Sassoons. I did not come across that, but I think could be later on as time goes by. And I think one of the important things from a religious point of view, that it's interesting, as much as they settled in Bombay, there wasn't a prominent rabbi that when they got stuck on a religious issue or ethical issue to turn to, they always turned back to Baghdad, because that is really kind, their home turf from a religious point of view. And so they saw the Bnei Israel as outsiders. It's one thing there were Jews from Aleppo, from Alexandria, from other parts of the Ottoman Empire, and they definitely got together. The European Jews, I think there were some, I'm not sure of the exact number, but then Bombay in itself in the 1830s, 40s was bizarre because, for example, both the Sassoons or the Parsis or others were looked down at by the British. So everyone has their own little,
yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So I guess, matrimony would not have been on the cards for these. You have a bit in the book where one family member is looking for a wife, for a bride for her son, and you say, she has to be young, she has to be rich, she has to be beautiful, and she has to be a practicing Jew, and that's a lot of things. And
it is a lot of conditions. It's definitely a lot of conditions. Yeah. And they remember, what is really amazing and one of the things that I was mesmerized in researching, how we think we're in a globalized world. Yeah. They were really in the globalized world because there were open borders. You got up and went from point A to B to C without worrying about passport and definitely no COVID testing wherever you go. But it was easy, to correspond, and a son came into Bombay to marry someone or vice versa. And the traffic to Baghdad continued in the sense of trading, studying, religious merchants. So it continued in the first and second generation to supply, with inverted commas, either grooms or brides to those who can't find anyone in India.
Okay, I just thought before opening up for audience Q&A, just wanted to thank everyone for the wonderful responses we've got to the session and the lovely anecdotes and the sources that were shared with us prior to today. And if I can request the AVID team to share the first little nugget we received.
Oh, wow.
So if you all see, this is the flying license of JRD Tata, which is signed by Victor Sassoon, who was then the chairman of the Aero Club of India and Burma. I think these are, two very dashing men, and I think maybe Joseph can tell us a little bit about them. But this was shared to us by Homi Khushu Khan, whose father who worked with the ED Sassoon firm for all his life. So thank you, Homi, for sharing this with us. And you can see Victor Sassoon's signature at the bottom, saying Victor Sassoon, chairman. Joseph, any comment?
Yes. So Victor Sassoon was injured in just around World War I. It's not really clear whether he was injured when his plane crashed, either in training or during the war itself. He suffered from a limp and he always had a cane. Later on, it got much worse. So flying was his one of his loves. The other one that everywhere you go, whether in India or China, is the horse racing. He won the Derby 4 times. He definitely was a restless personality, extremely wealthy, moved a lot of money from India to China, tripled it in 10 years because real estate in China was really rocketing, and didn't know how to pull out at the right time. He was an avid photographer. He has the most amazing collection of something like 5,000 to 7,000 photographs that he has taken. He walked everywhere, whether in India or China, with a camera. So he was a playboy, definitely. A good, loved food and all the, hobnobbing with there is a picture in the book with Charlie Chaplin and Marlene Dietrich that was rumored to be his girlfriend. But flying, and it's interesting, both he and other members, when they died, they left in their wills money for either the Air Force training or the Air Force Club.
Yeah, I mean, I think horse racing is the other comparison with the Aga Khans, and again, this lifestyle, glamour, Hollywood, all those things. So many similarities between these dynasties. And obviously, for us, Victor is so interesting because he's the founder of Hamilton Studios in Ballad Estate. Victor's spirit still roams around the estate and is around the studios and is well looked after, as the owners will tell you.
Yes.
So it's strange ways that, things continue in Bombay. And the other source, please. Okay, so this is a deed for the lease of a lease of land on Malabar Hill between Hannah David, who was the daughter of E.D. Sassoon, and Mulraj Khatau from the Khatau family. This was in 1904. And this is presently the site of the Khatau family bungalow at Malabar Hill. So this was leased from the Sassoons to the Khataus in 1904. And Ilesha Khatau kindly shared this with us yesterday. So we're very grateful for all these sources. And just before we open up, Joseph, you have this wonderful thing in the book where you say that when Flora Sassoon leaves Bombay for London, for England, she has a farewell, and a Parsi girl comes with a garland, and the garland is inscribed with Her Majesty, the Queen of Bombay and Empress of Malabar Hill. So clearly this family had a lot going on in Malabar Hill, as they did in Rampart Row, and obviously in Baikala and Mazgaon as well. So these are all the Bombay corners of the Sassoons. And we have, okay, now let me quickly go through. How does the poet Siegfried Sassoon fit in?
Yes. So in the book, you will see at the beginning of the book, there is a big family tree. And one of the problems in this book has been the names and the family tree, because it is so complicated. Many of them are called David and Rachel and repeat the same name. His father, he is a fourth generation of the Sassoon. He is one of the descendants of Albert Sassoon. But by these fourth generation, it's very interesting because I think Siegfried Sassoon epitomized really everything. He didn't know that he was Jewish. He didn't know that originally his father is a Baghdadi. He really knew only one thing, that he's English. And his father was cut off by the family when he married an English woman at the time. And he didn't know about that either until his father died. And he found out about his origins only when his father died when he was 13 years old.
And I think you mentioned that his sexuality was also a sort of question mark.
Correct. We're talking about Britain circa 1940s, where it was illegal to be gay, and people were sent to court and imprisoned.
Okay, we have a question from Farooq Jijina. What kind of relationship did the Sassoons share with the Gigi boys?
So there is some correspondence. I think that the notion all these traders chatted to each other, there is no doubt about it. There was coordination. If you look at the composition of boards, like of the textile boards of the India, it's really funny because they tend to be the same 10, 15 people just shifting around. And when the Sassoons create a textile mill, they invite the same 6, 7 people to join the board. When, let's say, Tata has a textile, he invites the Sassoon and the other. It was a little club of all those traders, and I give you and you give me, and I invite you and you invite me. And it's really interesting. It's a very different environment from what you read today about, competition. There was a competition between them, but there was also a sense of real gentlemen, I mean, you can be very competitive, but there were rules and etiquette that was followed by all of them, which have gone out of the window 50 years later.
Okay, there's a question from Cyrus Patel who says, could you tell us about the Sassoon's contribution to the textile trade?
Yeah, so it's interesting. The trade actually was more developed by the Edie Sassoon than the David Sassoon. And David Sassoon, once Flora is out of action, there really isn't any proper leadership. And so they are chasing each other. I think it's interesting, at some point, the combination of mills between David Sassoon and Edie Sassoon is the largest one component in the whole country. I mean, there was almost 34, 36 mills. And each one of them, by the way, and in the book, there are these beautiful posters, colored posters of some of these mills. They were okay, profitable, but then comes World War I and they become very, very profitable. And then more problems develop and they start going down, and they are really kind of stuck. They want to go out, but they don't know what business they go to. It is very clear by then, opium has few years left in that business. And part of the problem of the family, that there was really lacked. I mean, Victor basically said, no more textile, no more opium, no more things. We'll focus on the new thing, which is real estate. And I guess to a certain extent, that was a good bet, but he didn't figure out that China is going to change. And he misread those in a big way. But it was always running behind. And it's very, very interesting, because some of these traders that we spoke about, who were in opium and textile and others in India, began to figure out that the wave of industrialization and industrial revolution is going to come to India and change everything. And in a way, they adapted quicker and more easily to these changes. But they had a leadership, which I argue that the Sassoon kind lost it. Definitely David Sassoon at the end of Flora.
Right. You have this nice bit about Flora visiting the mills after her day at work.
Yes, every day she would go. Yes.
Speak to the managers, and, it's remarkable. We have a question. Did they have any views about the Indian independence struggle, which coincided with much of the period we are discussing? You have a lot on nationalism generally. So
I do have a lot of nationalism, and I argue in the book, there were some Baghdadi Jews that left after independence and got promoted in different things, including one senior person who became, I think, a general during the India-Pakistan war. I think they really misread that. I think their association that independence will end everything because was a mistake. I think they really were so associated with the old British Guard that, in my opinion, they really could not understand what was happening. And in a way, like all these surprises, you're not talking to the right sources. Remember, Victor left from 1926, comes back in 1937 when the Japanese invaded. Well, he's out 11 years and he wants to come back and plant himself again in Indian politics, not realizing that the train has moved so far ahead that you can't get any more on that train.
Yes, I mean, the question is whether Victor got, Indian nationalism wrong, and he thought he got Chinese nationalism right before it went to communism, and
Correct.
We have a question from R. Venkatesh. What were their views and attitude towards welfare of their mill workers and other staff in Bombay? Were they any different or better than European mill owners of that age?
So there is a report that says actually the Sassoon mills are actually the sanitary conditions were better than anywhere else. But the prices were, the wages were definitely competitive. There was an issue when strikes were erupting. They erupted also in the Sassoon mills. I don't think they avoided it. But I think there is one or two reports indicating that their conditions were quite good, relatively speaking. But I think this whole industry was in such a turmoil. And I don't think it, as I said, I keep kind of repeating, it really lacked the leadership from 1900 onward.
Okay, question from Dinesh Rana. Where and what are the Sassoons doing nowadays? Which is a very broad question. And also Naresh Fernandez, who asked about Vidal Sassoon. This is a common question. Is there any connection with the famous hairdresser? So
no, there is no connection, and I talk about that in the book. There is no connection whatsoever. Vidal Sassoon is originally from Aleppo. I think his father and grandfather are all from Syria. Now, if you go back 400 years before, again, open borders, people moved from Baghdad to Basra, to Alexandria, to Aleppo. Aleppo was relatively close to Baghdad. Trading families moved around. Put it this way, that there is no connection of him to the Sassoons of Baghdad. Is there a connection, I don't know, 400 years before? I cannot tell you that. What are the Sassoons today doing? Spread all around the world. Some of them know about the old glory. Others have just heard about it, and maybe now they're going to read the book and reflect on it. It's interesting, when I was just in London promoting the book and having meeting, I met with some Sassoons that I haven't met before. And the reactions are different. Some are very happy that someone has. Others still have this image in their head which they don't want to change. They were told by their fathers and grandfathers and grandmothers about the family, and want to stick with that notion. It's like all families, it's not a perfect family.
Okay. There's a question from Anmol Dhawan who's saying, nice to see you again. I think he's done work on Shanghai and Bombay. Did you have access to documents, basically your research process, if you can tell us a little bit about that, the archives?
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned at the beginning of the book, I was really less interested. And as a historian, what tipped the balance is I saw some reference to one of these documents that I showed you in the Baghdadi Jewish dialect, and I couldn't understand if it's there, but I realized because it's very difficult to decode that no one has used it. Once I found that, I decided, well, that's a fascinating project since no one worked and they really kept almost every scrap of paper. But then there were others. I used the Indian National Archives. I used Victor Sassoon's archives, which are in Dallas, Texas. I used, of course, different British archives, whether it's the National, whether the Rothschild archives. I used the Shanghai Municipal Archives and the police archives. And newspapers, by the way, are critical for such a project. Indian newspapers, British newspapers, Chinese newspapers, like in Shanghai in English, and one actually Genbao, the Chinese newspaper. They're really incredible. And again, one of the things that shook me, the newspapers in a place like Shanghai reported on the transport on every ship that arrived, what's in it, who owns the bulk of it. I mean, we're talking pre-computers, and yet you have this, like almost the financial pages fill in with all the details. There was a lot of material, and of course on opium, there are commissions of inquiry of 7 volumes and a huge number. And there is the digitization of a lot. The India office in London has a lot of things. Diaries were very, very important. There was a lot of material.
Yeah, I think Victor Sassoon's archive would probably be the most exciting, and lots of photographs of beautiful
Yes.
women in different stages of dress that he took over several years.
Yes.
All now in the archives and to be studied. One second. Okay, Mohan Narayan is asking, did the Sassoons and the Kaduris share a cordial relationship in Shanghai, especially after the Opium Wars?
There was relationship. They knew each other. The first Kaduri worked for the Sassoon, but then left after 10 years and began on his own. It's interesting, the comparison with the two, because when World War II erupted, Victor managed to get out of Shanghai and all the family. The Kaduris did not and were interned. And then they were released from the intern and went back to Hong Kong, and they got re-interned again because by then Hong Kong was occupied. And I think the comparisons between the two is really interesting. While the Sassoons were not interned, they lost the business. Yet the Kaduris, who were interned between Shanghai and Hong Kong for 4 years and lost everything, managed to restart the whole process in Hong Kong. One of the big mistakes that Victor committed is he cut his ties with Hong Kong. And I don't need to tell anyone what happened to the economy of Hong Kong from 1946 to the 1990s. I mean, I don't know whether it's 10 times, 20 times, 30 times, but everything turned their gold, and he sold it at the cheapest prices at the end of World War II. So that's another reason for the lack of imagination and leadership.
There's a comment from Adrian Sassoon, who says, I believe Vidal Sassoon may have had another surname before arrival in England. That's what he told me himself. Okay, and Sushil Premchand is asking, why is Flora Sassoon not as widely recognized as her great-grandfather? Is it because she was a woman, even though she was described as the queen of Malabar Hill?
Good question. And I have to say, yes, unfortunately, because it's a woman. So there are 3 books about the Sassoon, one written in the 1930s by a historian, in the 1960s by a journalist, and there is a book in Hebrew which talks about the family. The book in Hebrew and the others talk about Flora, 3 lines, and about her husband, 6 pages. Okay. I think it's one of the hidden aspects of this archive that, she really gets back what is due to her as a leader, as a woman, as a changer, really, of so many things, both in Bombay and then later on in London. And I hope the book will be a small contribution to that.
Okay, Joseph, a question that I wanted to ask. Can you tell us about your background and your own personal journey? How are you related to David Sassoon, and what did you hear about the family from your parents and your grandparents, as well as growing up?
When David Sassoon fled Baghdad because of the conflict with the corrupt governor, his siblings stayed behind. I am the descendants of one of those siblings. And that's why I said there was no pogrom. I mean, if there is a pogrom, as a father, you don't take just one child and leave others behind. I am one of those who stayed actually in Baghdad, grew up in Baghdad. And there is a little bit of a parallel that we had to escape in the 1970s. By then, Iraq was under Saddam Hussein, and it was in a bad situation. The country in general, but also particularly for the Jewish community. And we escaped also via Iran in the 1970s. So a little bit of, writing the book reconnected me in the sense of what it is as an immigrant family to start everything from a beginning, because we really also lost everything behind in Baghdad. I think that I never really was interested in the family. I tell the little joke in the book that when I was a teenager, 12, 13, my father wanted to start telling me I would run and put my fingers in my ear just to irritate him. When I was writing the book and I was getting stuck time and again, I kept wishing if I could ask only one question. Well, just shows you have to tell your children the story of your family when they're really ready to hear it.
Yes. Asad, can we go on, or shall we?
I think we can just wrap up, Simin, at this point, if you've got any closing remarks.
Not closing note. There's someone who's asking about the decline of the family. If you'd see it as that, or what are your thoughts on thinking about a dynasty in those terms, in terms of decline? It's not a term you use in your title or anything like that, but is it a helpful term? And
well, editors have very strong emotions and feelings about titles. No one wants to call their book Rise and Demise. But it is a decline. The very English word extravagance symbolizes that you spend so much money, you ended up with no money. It's definitely, the book is 2 parts. Part 1 about the rise, part 1 about the decline. The decline, not just economically, but it is about culture. It is about assimilation with Britain and Anglicization. It is when it becomes an ideology, this assimilation, much more than a business or a tradition.
Thanks. I think you used the word adored in a very sweet way in the book, and we really adored the book. And thank you for sharing all these nuggets with us.
Thank you, Simin, for your wonderful discussion, and thank you, Asad, and thank you to all the people. Really much appreciated.
Thank you, Joseph, for sharing such interesting insights and perspectives. And congratulations on this book. And to Simin, I mean, obviously, for this kind introduction to you and so skillfully anchoring this conversation. I mean, she's one of our regular collaborators at Avid. You know, for me, this is a very special topic because, you know, as many of you know, the Avid team has been involved with the Kalagura Arts Festival for many years. And I've been fortunate to be one of the co-curators of the literature section. And we've been hosting those at the David Sassoon Library. So, you know, we've always been so intrigued, enamored. We've spent many nights out there. And so, you know, to hear and learn so much more about the family is also very special. But thank you so much. And thank you to our audiences for tuning in such large numbers. Once again, apologies on the rescheduling, but we are so happy to have you here. The benefit is we're recording this. It'll be on YouTube in 2 days. So the people who couldn't join us from yesterday will have access to this wonderful discussion. You know, but we, you know, at Avid, we love working with our partners. Thank you to the Bombaywalla historical work, Simin and her team, to the Bangalore Literature Festival. I mean, they're just wonderful collaborators that we've been working with through lockdown, Penguin Random House. And most of you, to our audiences, thank you for being with us. And, you know, we have many, many interesting programs lined up at Avid. We always believe that learning never stops. So our next one, again on cities, we're going to look at the city of Pondicherry on Thursday the 10th, part of our Cultural Capital series. To find out more, just check out our website or stalk us on social media. But until then, remember that learning never stops, and stay healthy, stay safe. And, you know, just as we are ramping up to welcome you back to our physical events, we're still enjoying this new or this old avatar of ours virtually. But thank you once again for all the support, and have a wonderful evening and a good week ahead. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.